10-Minute Murder contains depictions of actual crimes. What you are about to hear is real and violent in nature. Discretion is advised. This is 10-Minute Murder.
Welcome to 10-Minute Murder, the brief and bingeable true crime podcast. My name is Joe, I'm the host, and thank you for being here. If you're new to the podcast, thanks for checking it out today, and I hope after the episode, you'll consider subscribing or following or whatever your app happens to say. When you subscribe, you'll automatically get new episodes. You don't have to go searching a couple of times a week to find them. And while I'm talking about connecting with 10-Minute Murder, you can also find this show on social media. Links are in the show notes of this episode, or just type it into the search and it'll pop right up. On Facebook and Instagram, I post visuals that go along with the stories you hear about. Nothing gross or graphic, but enough for you to put a face with the names that you're hearing about and sometimes the locations that you're hearing about. The killer you're going to hear about today has murder numbers that are absolutely beyond comprehension. He's been described as the world's worst serial killer. Based on that alone, you'd think, well, he'll never breathe a breath of free air again. You'll hear why. By the time you hear this, he may already be free. He has admitted to the rape, torture, and murder of 138 boys and teenagers. Based on maps he drew for officials to find the remains of his victims, his actual number could be closer to 300, maybe more. They still aren't sure. This is the beast, La Bestia, Luis Garavito. As of this recording, Luis Garavito is 64 years old. He was born and lives currently in Colombia. In the small community of Geneva, where he's from, they say Luis's mother was a longtime prostitute. His mother had been viciously abused by Garavito's father, who was a heavy alcoholic, and would also abuse Garavito's siblings as well. As a child, Garavito's father forced him to watch his mother do her job being sex with paying customers. And sometimes those customers would pay a little extra to have sex with Luis. He eventually found a way to escape and ran away from home, living on the Colombian streets. At the age of 8, Luis was found by a man that promised him a hot meal and a place to rest. He accepted the invitation, but instead of shelter and food, the man led Garavito to an abandoned house where he was sexually assaulted. A few days later, Luis joined a rebellious gang for protection. The gang robbed people for food, money, and cars, which they exchanged for money at local chop shops. From there, Luis moved often, doing jobs around Colombia. His friends described him at the time as kind, yet easily angered. If you've listened to 10-Minute Murder for any length of time, you know that the reason that I always try to mention the childhood or background of the killer is to show that way more often than not, it's filled with some sort of abuse. Obviously, there are exceptions, and some cases are more extreme than others, but Luis Garavito was shown, by the way he was treated, who the most vulnerable people were: the poor, homeless, and orphan boys between the ages of 6 and 16. That became the type he was after. He approached young boys, got them alone if they weren't already, and offered them small gifts, money, candy, or even odd jobs, similar to how he himself was lured at a young age. Sometimes he'd tell the boys that he was a priest, a farmer, a drug dealer, street vendor, or even homeless like they were. He always offered something he knew they needed, and often changed his disguise and routine to keep the authorities from tracking him. Once he had a boy convinced to come with him, he'd have him walk with him somewhere, a distance away, to make him tired, so that they'd put up less of a fight. He bound their hands, took off their clothes, tortured, raped, and killed them, sometimes decapitating them. The torture involved stabbing sharp objects into their anus. Their testicles were severed and placed into their mouths. When police found some of the victims, beside the bodies they found bottles of lubricant and empty liquor bottles. Evidence showed that many suffered extensive and long-lasting torture. For years, these murders had gone unnoticed because many of the victims had no police report filed on their disappearance. Gatherings of bodies had begun showing up all over Colombia, but authorities didn't pay too much attention to it from 1992 until about 1997, when they discovered mass graves. It was hard for them to ignore that. Because the murders weren't in one or two specific locations, the investigation was widespread. In February 1998, the bodies of 2 naked children were found together on a hill. The next day, very close to the same location, another body was discovered. All 3 had been killed the same way, had signs of sexual abuse, and had their hands bound together. At the scene, investigators found a note, a handwritten note, that I'm sure Luis did not intend to be found. It was the address that led them to Garavito's girlfriend's house, his girlfriend of many years. She told police that she had not seen him in months, but gave them a bag that he had left with her. Inside the bag, the police found pictures of young boys, a journal that inside detailed the murders, tally marks counting its victims, as well as bills. On those bills was an address. They went to that house but found it was vacant. A few days later, he happened to get arrested while attempting to rape another boy. A homeless man saw what was happening and intervened. He was questioned about all the murdered boys, but denied being the culprit. As they described some of the details of those cases, Luis broke down into tears. They had a good feeling that he was La Bestia, but could not quite prove it yet. Garavito has an eye condition, a rare one that requires him to wear specific glasses. A pair of these unique glasses was found at one of the mass grave sites. They also compared DNA samples found on and in the bodies to Luis. It was a match. When confronted with this new information, Luis confessed to murdering 140 boys. He was charged with 172 murders altogether. He helped the police by drawing maps to locate some of the missing victims. He was tried and found guilty of 138 murders. In the U.S., if the state allowed the death penalty, he would without a doubt have been put on death row. If the state didn't, he could expect life without the possibility of parole. But this is Colombia we're talking about. The maximum penalty for murder is about 13 years. Multiplied by the number of his victims, Luis Garavito was sentenced to 1,853 years and 9 days in prison. However, Colombian law has a limit of 40 years or 60 years if the crimes were committed against children. So it would be reasonable to assume he'd get the full 60, right? No. Because he helped authorities find the bodies of many of the missing victims, his sentence was reduced to 22 years. 138 murdered children, 22-year sentence. As of this recording, Luis Garavito, La Bestia, is being held in a maximum security prison in Colombia. He's kept away and secluded from the other prisoners because they know he would be immediately killed for what he's done by the other prisoners. He recognizes that his sentence was very light for the crimes he committed and only takes food and drinks given to him by the people that he knows for fear of being poisoned. The guards say he's positive and respectful and studying to become a politician. He is scheduled to be released sometime in 2021 and plans to start a career in activism, helping abused children. That's today's 10-Minute Murder, the brief and bingeable true crime podcast. I appreciate you listening today, and if you have a story that you would like for me to possibly cover on this podcast, you can email it to me, 10minutemurder@gmail.com. It's the number 10. You don't write it out. You put the number 10, 10minutemurder@gmail.com. You can easily connect with 10-Minute Murder on social media. Just click the link in the show notes of this episode. Or even easier than that, you can just type 10-Minute Murder into Facebook or Instagram, and it'll pop right up. Before you go, subscribe if you have not done that already, and you will never miss another episode of 10-Minute Murder. And if you have friends that are into brief true crime stories, let them know about 10-Minute Murder. And lastly, I don't know how well you could hear it, but in this room, my dog Harper was snoring like crazy loud. So if you hear like a big truck going by in the background every 10 seconds, it's not a big truck. It's my big, chunky, sleeping dog in the background. So, sorry about that. Thanks for listening. Have a good night.